Recently, I've been thinking a lot about the concept of motivation. More specifically, how if we change the way we think about it, we can actually have more of it. After completing all the models in my spearhead, I figured it was time to crank out a centerpiece model, a general. And what better character to lead these Cryptcast Infernals than the dragon-riding Ionis Cryptborn? I mean, it's right there in his name. Putting this beefcake together, I noticed several points in the instructions telling you to paint something before putting it together. Props to GW for going the extra step to suggest appropriate sub-assemblies. But let's be honest, this is a gaming piece. We're yelling YOLO and gluing it all together. If a brush can't get to an area, there's no way it'll be visible either. I've been hacking off all the super tall collars on all the units in this army, and while Ionis didn't have a particularly egregious collar, I decided to leave the throne-like saddle back off. It changed up the silhouette in a way I liked and felt better suited to this Cryptcast Infernal army. Then, once again following the theme of this army, this big old dragon needed a little head surgery. Skulls for everyone. Are they chaos corrupted? Death corrupted? Who knows? But I like the skull theme. Now back to motivation. Often it seems that we're fed the idea that motivation is this force that suddenly hits us, causing us to suddenly move forward towards some goal or objective, as though we have no control over this force, and we have to sit and wait for it to hit us. The problem with this version or concept of motivation is the implication that we have limited or perhaps zero control over it, and maybe this isn't the healthiest way to consider it. After completely knocking this beast and rider together, and a little priming, I hosed the whole thing down with burnt sienna, as I've done with this entire army. It's a great rusty and dusty base, and the consistent shadow color helps maintain some unity throughout the whole force. The wings were pretty massive though, so to give myself a bit of a head start with highlights, I loaded up the airbrush with scruffulous brown, and sprayed the wings from above and in front of the model, quickly giving these billowing wings a bit of contrast. And this is where motivation, or at least how I think about it, enters the conversation. Rather than waiting for this sort of force to suddenly overtake me, I consider motivation to be more like momentum. See, in my experience, the simple act of doing leads to more doing, as well as the opposite, where not doing leads to more, well, you get the picture. Kind of like the combination of physics and psychology. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Seeing results on the mini I'm working on builds a ton of momentum for me. This is why I started with the scale and skin of the dragon. Visually, it's a massive chunk of the model, and seeing loads of progress leads me to painting more and more. The front of these guys would see the most eyeballs, so I painted all of the scales individually, giving them more attention. For the back half, which is mostly hidden behind the wings, I grabbed the dry brush and used the same paints, jade, bright jade, and a mix of bright jade and pale yellow, to quickly highlight the scales and skin. I didn't make the back half quite as bright or vibrant as the front, as it would see less light. With the jade scales and skin done, I moved to the skin of the wings. These wings have some pretty excellent texture to them, which can make your life easier or more difficult, depending on how much work you put into all of the texture. I decided to primarily ignore it to begin with, simply painting on my sketchy little brush strokes, starting with straight scruffulous brown, then mixing in more and more pale yellow as I painted less and less surface, creating volumes and highlights. Finally, to bring out more of the lovely texture in this sculpt, I dry brushed pure pale yellow, focusing on the highest, brightest points, and using very gentle pressure to just pick out the edges of the texture. Dry brushing can be an extremely useful tool, regardless of where you are in your painting journey. So, if we think about motivation as momentum, how do we build it? Well, I like to break things down to the easiest, most basic step and start there. Painting an entire model can seem like an enormous, unattainable task. Something that will destroy momentum by not even starting. If I can convince myself to paint a single boot, a strap, something impossibly small compared to the scope of a project, I'll most often keep painting, moving on to more and more. If I don't have much time to hobby, I'll have multiple projects on the go at different stages. Not enough time to paint? Cut some pieces from the sprue. Start assembling something. Prime a few models or give them the undercoat. Accomplishing even the smallest step builds momentum or motivation that carries through to the periods in which I have more time. It all compounds, and I find that I can accomplish a lot. All of the armor and metallic surfaces were done in the same way as the rest of this army. Thin, sketchy brushstrokes, beginning with neutral gray. Then about a 50-50 mix of neutral and bright neutral gray, finishing with a sparing use of pure bright neutral gray. I leave plenty of random patches of the underpainted burnt sienna, as well as staying away from the recesses entirely. I find this gives a nice dusty and rusty appearance, with plenty of contrast between the highs and lows. Like armor that was formerly spectacular and is slowly falling into ruin. The shoulder pauldrons and all the inlaid skulls were first washed with highly thinned down orange, a great starting point for some rusty surfaces. Then started working on some volumes with scrofulous brown. I like the idea that these panels and insets were made of some different material, one that's been more readily corrupted by whatever force has taken hold of this army. It's become so rusty, it no longer has any shine at all. Even the particularly worn spots are just a lighter, vaguely rusty color, which I achieve by mixing in more and more pale yellow to the scrofulous brown, some brushstrokes to the cape, and a few finishing touches, and this cryptastic rider was all done. Here you go, the finished centerpiece of my Cryptcast Infernal army, Ionis Cryptborn. I'd love to know what you think of him in the comments below. And let me know what you think about my take on motivation. Do you have any tips of your own to build and keep momentum in your hobby? Let's have that conversation in the comments. Most importantly, thanks for watching. You are awesome.